A chance encounter. It was a cool morning when Maya Williams set out from her small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden rays over the row of brownstones that lined the street. The city was waking up, its hum of activity just starting to buzz around her. Maya had always loved this time of day, the calm before the storm of noise and chaos that would fill the streets by noon. She adjusted her scarf, hands slipping into the pockets of her jacket, and walked down the familiar sidewalk. Maya had spent her entire life in this neighborhood, watching it change over the years. The cracks in the pavement that once seemed so permanent had been repaired and smoothed over. The old diner on the corner where she used to sit with friends had closed, replaced by a trendy cafe. Even the street vendors who once filled the air with their calls had been replaced by boutique shops with sleek, modern windows. Maya had watched it all with a mixture of nostalgia and wariness. Change wasn't always progress, especially when it meant pushing people like her and her neighbors further to the edges. As she walked, Maya couldn't help but notice how quiet the street was that morning. The usual rush of cars, the chatter of people hurrying to work, the distant sounds of construction, it was all absent. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. She turned a corner and immediately saw what had caught her attention. Up ahead, near a bus stop, a group of 4 white men in their 20s were surrounding a young black girl, who appeared to be no older than 18. The girl's clothes were simple but neat, a plain hoodie, a pair of jeans, and sneakers. But the look on her face said everything. She was frightened. Maya's instincts kicked in, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. The men were too close, their body language aggressive, and the girl's body was hunched in a way that told Maya she wanted to escape but didn't know how. Maya's heart clenched, and before she could even think, her feet were already moving. She approached with purpose, her mind running through all the ways this could go. The men didn't notice her until she was nearly upon them, her boots tapping lightly on the sidewalk. "Hey!" Maya called, her voice carrying over the morning quiet, sharp and clear. "What's going on here?" One of the men, tall with disheveled blonde hair and a broad, menacing grin, turned toward her, sneering. "Nothing, just talking," he said dismissively, waving a hand as though Maya was being overly dramatic. Maya didn't miss the way the others closed in around the girl, blocking her path. The young woman's eyes flicked toward Maya, a mixture of hope and fear in her gaze. She was caught, but Maya knew she couldn't let her stay in this situation. "Talking?" Maya repeated, her voice growing more firm, laced with authority. "Doesn't look like talking to me. You're intimidating her." Another man, shorter with an unruly beard, grunted in annoyance. "We're offering her a job," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You know, a chance to get out of here, get a better life. Maybe you should mind your own business, lady." Maya felt her pulse quicken. She had heard this before, the disguised threats, the promises of opportunities that only led to exploitation. She stood taller, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the group in front of her. These men weren't offering a job, they were coercing the girl into something, and Maya wouldn't stand by and watch it happen. "I don't need to mind my business," Maya said, her voice unwavering. "This is my business now. And I'm telling you to let her go." For a brief moment, the men exchanged uncertain glances. Then the one with the beard stepped forward, his body language changing from casual to confrontational. He reached for the girl's arm, pulling her toward him. The girl gasped and stumbled, her foot catching on the uneven pavement. Maya didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, grabbing the girl's hand and pulling her toward her. "Come on, let's go," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. The girl didn't resist, instead clinging to Maya's hand like it was a lifeline. But the men weren't finished. One of them, the tall one with the blonde hair, stepped in front of them, blocking their path. "You think you can just walk away from us?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. He reached out, attempting to grab Maya's shoulder, but she was faster. Without thinking, she twisted away from his grasp and shoved his hand aside. The others started closing in, their laughter echoing off the walls of the surrounding buildings. Maya's heart was racing, but she kept her cool. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And neither is she." But then, just as things seemed to escalate, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Maya looked up, her eyes narrowing. The patrol car screeched to a halt, and a figure stepped out of the driver's side door. A tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in the crisp blue uniform of the police, approached. The men relaxed at the sight of him, as if they knew this would be their escape. Maya's chest tightened. Of all the officers in the city, of all the people who could have shown up, it had to be him. Drake. Officer Thomas Drake had a reputation that preceded him. Maya had known him from her past dealings with the police, always a man with a chip on his shoulder, a disdain for people who didn't look like him. Maya had seen it firsthand, the way he treated people of color, the way he turned a blind eye to injustice. He was known for his quick temper and his reluctance to step in when it came to incidents involving minorities. His presence didn't reassure Maya, it made her even more uneasy. Drake approached with a practiced, disinterested gait, scanning the scene as though he was about to assess a minor traffic violation. His eyes flicked over Maya first, then landed on the group of men. There was a flash of recognition in his eyes as his gaze lingered on Maya for just a moment longer than necessary. He knew who she was. They'd crossed paths in the past, but it wasn't the time for small talk. "Everything okay here?" Drake asked, his voice low, almost bored. Maya wasted no time. She quickly explained the situation, laying out the facts. The men had been harassing the young woman, offering her a job that didn't feel right, their words dripping with condescension and hidden threats. She made it clear that she was trying to help, that she had no intention of leaving without seeing the girl safe. But as she finished, Drake didn't look at her. Instead, he gave the men a quick glance and nodded. "You're just causing trouble," he said to Maya, his voice dismissive. "These guys are just offering her a chance. Maybe you should let them do their thing. People like her need help to get out of this place, you know." Maya's jaw clenched. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice low and controlled. "We can stand on our own. We don't need to be saved by people like you." Drake's lips curled into a mocking smile. "That attitude is why people like you stay at the bottom," he sneered. Maya felt a flash of fury, but she refused to react. Instead, she wiped her face slowly, as the anger inside her simmered but didn't boil over. The words didn't sting the way they once would have. This was not a battle to fight in the streets, not today. Without saying another word, Maya turned to the young woman, offering her a reassuring smile. "Let's go," she said softly, taking the girl's hand and leading her away from the scene. They didn't look back. The cold morning air pressed against Maya's face as she walked away, her thoughts racing. The feeling of injustice was heavy in her chest, but she knew there would be a time for action. That time would come soon enough, the weight of justice. The walk to Maya's apartment was a blur. The young girl, whose name Maya had learned was Kiera, remained quiet, her grip on Maya's hand firm but tentative. It was as if she wasn't sure whether to trust her or not, or perhaps, she didn't trust anyone at all anymore. Maya could feel the weight of that silence, the unsaid words hanging between them like a thick fog. But she didn't press Kiera. There was time for that later. Right now, Maya just wanted to get her somewhere safe. They reached her small, third-floor apartment, a modest space that had always been a sanctuary for Maya. The worn wooden floors creaked under their feet as they stepped inside, the scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee filling the air. It wasn't much, but it was home. Maya gestured for Kiera to sit on the couch, which was covered in a faded quilt that Maya had made herself years ago. The apartment had seen better days, but the comfort it provided was enough. "Sit down," Maya said softly, offering Kiera a seat. She then walked to the small kitchenette and started making tea, the quiet clink of cups against saucers breaking the stillness of the room. Kiera hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her eyes darting around the room as though trying to find something familiar or comforting. Her hands were shaking, and her eyes were clouded with a mix of fear and confusion. Maya didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in the way Kiera held herself, tensed, ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. Maya had seen this before in other young women who had been in similar situations. The fear of being trapped, of not knowing who to trust, could do that to a person. Maya placed the cup of tea on the table in front of Kiera and sat down across from her, giving her space but not too much. She waited. She knew Kiera needed time to process everything, but the silence was beginning to gnaw at her too. She could feel the pull of a conversation that needed to happen, the one that would unravel everything that had led to this moment. After a few minutes, Kiera's voice broke the silence. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who to trust anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing, you know? I just wanted to get out of the neighborhood. They said they could help me." Maya nodded, her gaze steady and compassionate. "They prey on people like you, Kiera. People who feel like they have no way out. They make promises of better lives, but what they really offer is nothing more than control." Kiera's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, as if trying to regain some semblance of composure. "But I don't have a lot of choices," she said, her voice cracking. "My mom is sick. I can't afford to go to college like my friends. All I want is something better. I don't want to stay in this place forever." Maya's heart ached for her. She knew all too well what it felt like to want something more, to feel trapped in a life that seemed too small, too limited. But she also knew that sometimes, the price of that, something better, came at too high a cost. "You don't have to give up who you are to get a better life, Kiera," Maya said firmly. "There's always a way out, but it's not the way they're offering. They want to use you, control you, make you think you're nothing without them. But you are so much more than that." Kiera looked down at her hands, rubbing her fingers together nervously. "I don't know how to get out of this. I don't know what to do." Maya leaned forward, her voice low but filled with purpose. "You can fight this. But you have to start by trusting the right people. Trust yourself. You've already taken the first step by walking away from them. That's more than most people ever do." The words hung in the air, a moment of connection between them. Kiera nodded slowly, her posture softening as she took in Maya's words. For the first time since they had met, she seemed to breathe a little easier, her shoulders less tense. "I'll help you," Maya said, her voice steady with resolve. "I'll help you find a way out. You're not alone in this. I promise." Kiera's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Maya saw something like hope flicker in the young woman's gaze. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Over the next few days, Maya kept in close contact with Kiera, taking her to different community centers, connecting her with local resources, and guiding her through the maze of options that lay ahead. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Kiera doubted herself, when the pressure of the world outside seemed overwhelming. But Maya was there every step of the way, offering support, reassurance, and, most importantly, protection. Meanwhile, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the events of that morning were not just a random encounter. The way Drake had shown up, the way he had treated Kiera, Maya had lived long enough to recognize when something was off. Drake's casual dismissal of the situation, his condescending remarks, and his treatment of Maya were all too familiar. It wasn't just that he didn't care about Kiera's safety. It was that he actively seemed to support the men's predatory behavior. Maya had to do something. But what? As the days passed, Maya began to piece together more information. The men who had harassed Kiera weren't just some random group. They were part of a network, a system that preyed on vulnerable people in their community. Maya knew that bringing them down would be no small feat, but it wasn't just about those men, it was about holding the system accountable. It was about showing people like Drake that there was no room for their brand of complacency, their disregard for human dignity. But the real question, the one that kept Maya up at night, was how? How could she expose them? How could she make them pay for the harm they had done? Then, it came to her. There was one way, one method that would force them to confront their actions. It would be risky, but it was the only way Maya could see that would give Kiera the justice she deserved. Maya would take them to court. But not in the way they might expect. The courtroom was a place where she could make her voice heard, where she could take back control. And it was the perfect place to ensure that justice would come swiftly, whether the men, or Drake, liked it or not. But as Maya began to make her plans, she knew there was more at stake than just the outcome of a trial. She would have to face her own fears, her own doubts, and her own history with the system. The courtroom wasn't just a place for Kiera. It was a place for Maya to reckon with the past and the future. It was a place where everything could change. The courtroom beckons. Maya had spent years building up a reputation, one grounded in determination and unwavering commitment to justice. After a decade of law school, internships, and clerkships, she had finally made it. She had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity, every promotion, every chance to rise above the challenges set before her. But even after reaching her goal of becoming a judge, she knew the path had been laden with obstacles, most of them invisible to those who had never been in her shoes. She wasn't just a judge. She was a black woman, navigating a system that wasn't designed for her, a system that had often worked against her rather than for her. Yet here she was, the youngest female judge in her district, a beacon of what was possible for others like her. The courtroom was where she had always felt the most powerful, where her sharp intellect and sense of fairness had allowed her to rise above the biases that existed in the world outside. But this time, this case, would be different. Maya wasn't just sitting behind the bench as an impartial figure of authority. She was going to be the one holding those who had wronged Kiera accountable. She wasn't just going to be a passive observer, she was going to make sure they paid for the damage they had caused. She had spent the last few days carefully gathering evidence, speaking with Kiera about everything she remembered, getting the testimonies of witnesses who had seen the men harassing her. The men's actions, their words, the way they manipulated the situation, every detail mattered. Maya wasn't about to let it slip away because of a lack of preparation. She had done this countless times before, but this felt different. She needed to make sure everything was airtight. This wasn't just about a young woman's life, this was about the systemic racism and corruption that pervaded the police force, and the world that allowed such people to slip through the cracks unscathed. If she could bring down these men, maybe, just maybe, she could change something larger, something that had been broken for far too long. As Maya prepared for the trial, she was met with a mix of support and concern from her colleagues. Her peers in the judiciary had always respected her, but there were whispers in the halls, murmurs of uncertainty. This case had the potential to stir up trouble, to shake up the delicate balance of the system that had been built over decades. Many of the men in power didn't want the kind of change Maya was bringing, and they would make their displeasure known. But Maya was used to that. She had always stood on the edge, walking a line between the law and justice. This case, though, felt like a true test of both. The day of the trial arrived quicker than Maya had anticipated. As she stood in front of her reflection that morning, adjusting her judicial robes, she couldn't help but think back to the moment when she had made the decision to become a lawyer. It had been years ago, when she was still a teenager living in a neighborhood much like the one Kiera came from. Maya had seen injustice firsthand, the kind that seemed to be accepted as part of life. She had watched her friends and family get caught in a system that had failed them, that had taken away their opportunities, their dignity, and their future. That was when she had decided that enough was enough. She would make a difference. And now, all these years later, the chance had come. She could almost feel the weight of her ancestors' spirits urging her forward, pushing her to right the wrongs of a system that had never truly served people like her. Maya arrived at the courthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the murmur of reporters outside, the clicking of cameras as they snapped photos of her. She was well known in her community, but this case would put her under a microscope in a way she hadn't experienced before. The stakes were high. She was about to face some of the most powerful and dangerous men in her city, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. The courtroom was packed. Kiara was sitting nervously in the front row, her eyes wide with fear and anticipation. Maya had made sure she had a lawyer to represent her, someone trustworthy who had worked on cases like this before. But Maya knew it was going to be her words, her presence in the courtroom, that would truly make the difference. This was her fight. Maya stepped into the courtroom, her gaze steady, her steps measured. The room fell silent as she approached the bench. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but she didn't waver. She knew what she had to do. The defense team was already there. A man in a sharply tailored suit stood at the podium, his cold eyes scanning the room. He was representing the group of men who had harassed Kiara. Maya knew him, James Whitaker. He had a reputation for being a smooth talker, someone who could manipulate the truth to fit his client's narrative. He had worked in high-profile cases before, defending those who had the resources to afford him. He wasn't used to losing. When the trial officially began, Whitaker stood up, his voice commanding as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is a case about a young woman who has been led astray by people with an agenda. These men were simply offering a job to someone who needed it, and now they find themselves on trial for a crime they did not commit. The defendant is a victim of her own assumptions and an overzealous individual who has decided to twist the truth to fit her narrative." Maya's eyes flicked to Kiara, whose hands were folded tightly in her lap. The young woman was listening intently, but it was clear that Whitaker's words had struck a chord with her. Maya could see the fear in Kiara's eyes, the self-doubt creeping in. She knew this was going to be a battle for more than just the outcome of the case. It was going to be a fight to keep Kiara's confidence intact, to remind her that she was in the right, that she deserved justice. Maya stood, her voice steady and calm as she addressed the court. This case is not about assumptions or misunderstandings. This case is about the actions of these men and the way they treated a young woman, a member of our community, with no respect or dignity. They did not offer her a job. They harassed her, threatened her, and manipulated her in a way that is far too common in our society. This is not about jobs or opportunities, it is about control. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the jury, letting her words sink in. "I am here today to ensure that this kind of behavior is not tolerated. I am here today to hold these men accountable for their actions. And I am here today to remind Kiara, and everyone in this room, that she has the right to walk this world with dignity and without fear." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Even Whitaker seemed momentarily taken aback. Maya could feel the power of the moment, the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about one girl and a few men, it was about something much larger. It was about the countless people who had been silenced, dismissed, and treated as less than human. It was about a fight for justice in a world that didn't always want to see it. Maya could hear her heartbeat in her ears as she prepared to move forward. The trial had just begun, but she could already feel the momentum building. She had no intention of letting this case slip away. Not this time. The battle was on, the reckoning. The trial unfolded with a steady rhythm, the motions of justice taking shape, one argument at a time. Maya sat behind the bench, her gaze unwavering, her mind sharp and focused on every word, every piece of evidence, every subtle shift in the room. She had been in countless trials before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the significance of the case, the high stakes for the community, or even the pressure from the public and media, it was the weight of the lives at stake. Kiera sat nervously at her seat, often with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but Maya could see the spark of determination in her eyes. Each day that passed, she grew stronger. Maya had taken great care to remind Kiera of her worth, to reinforce that she was not just a victim of circumstance but someone with the power to make a change, to take back control over her own narrative. The words they spoke in that courtroom weren't just legal arguments, they were pieces of a larger story, a story that Kiera would carry with her forever. As the days stretched on, the defense team employed every tactic they could to discredit the case. They tried to paint Kiera as a girl with a troubled past, someone who had made poor decisions, someone who had willingly associated with the wrong people. They wanted to shift the blame onto her, to make it seem like she had asked for trouble. But each time they pushed, Maya was there with a counterargument, a reminder that Kiera's actions were a result of desperation, not a lack of judgment. Maya wasn't interested in attacking Kiera's character, she didn't have to. All she needed to do was expose the men for who they truly were. The first day of testimony was brutal. One by one, witnesses who had been present during the incident took the stand, recounting their versions of what happened. The defense tried to discredit each of them, labeling them as biased, accusing them of embellishing the facts. They tried to twist every detail into something that suited their narrative, but Maya wasn't fooled. The evidence spoke for itself, and the truth wasn't something they could bury, no matter how much they tried. Maya could feel the tension in the room, thick as a storm cloud. There was a sense of inevitability hanging over the proceedings, as though everyone knew where this was heading but were still unsure how far it would go. The defense wasn't going to back down easily. Neither was Maya. When it came time for Kiera to testify, the room fell into a heavy silence. She stood slowly, her legs trembling slightly as she approached the witness stand. Maya gave her a reassuring smile from across the room, but she could see the fear in Kiera's eyes. She could sense the young woman's uncertainty, the deep well of doubt that still lingered despite all the support she had received. Kiera had spent most of her life being told she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong, and now she was being asked to stand in front of a room full of strangers and relive the moment she was most ashamed of, being powerless in the face of violence and discrimination. Maya's heart ached for her. "Take your time," Maya said softly, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "No one here is going to rush you." Kiera nodded, her hands shaking as she placed them on the stand. She glanced down at her feet, her voice barely audible as she began recounting what had happened that day. She spoke of the men's words, how they had cornered her, the way they had used false promises to manipulate her into thinking she had no other choice. She spoke of the humiliation, of the way they had tried to treat her like nothing more than a tool to be used for their own gain. The words came haltingly, but with each sentence, Kiera seemed to regain a little more of her confidence. When she spoke of the moment that Maya had stepped in, of how the men had tried to silence her too, Kiera's voice broke. But she didn't stop. She didn't back down. "I thought I was going to die that day," Kiera said, her voice trembling but strong. "I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew it wasn't good. I was so scared. I didn't think anyone would believe me. But she did." She paused and looked directly at Maya. "She believed me. She didn't turn away like everyone else." Maya held her breath as Kiera finished her testimony. The room was silent for a moment, and then Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Kiera. It wasn't just a nod of acknowledgement, it was a silent promise, one that Kiera would understand even if no one else did. Maya would make sure justice was done, no matter the cost. The defense was quick to pounce on Kiera's testimony, trying to pick apart every word. They painted her as an unreliable witness, accusing her of fabricating parts of the story. But the more they pushed, the more the jury seemed to lose their faith in the defense's arguments. Every time the defense tried to undermine Kiera, Maya's objections were swift and strong. She wouldn't let the narrative slip away. Not this time. As the trial continued, Maya kept a steady presence in the courtroom. She had seen countless lawyers try to manipulate the law to suit their own purposes, but she wasn't going to let that happen here. She wasn't just a judge, she was the one who would make sure the law was held to its highest standard. This case wasn't just about the facts, it was about the principle that justice must be blind to race, class, and status. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter where they came from, had the right to be heard, to be treated fairly. The days passed, and with each passing moment, Maya grew more resolute. She could see the cracks in the defense's case, the lies they tried to weave, and she knew the truth was slowly starting to seep through. The jury was listening, carefully weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and the actions of the men in question. The defense's attempts to paint Kiera as an unreliable witness had failed. Now it was just a matter of how quickly the jury would come to their decision. But Maya knew that the hardest part was still to come. She had to hold the men accountable, not just for their actions against Kiera, but for the deeper issue they represented, a system that allowed people like them to continue doing harm without fear of repercussions. Maya's eyes flicked toward the defense table, where the men sat, their faces unreadable. She could see the arrogance in their posture, the belief that they were untouchable. They were wrong. They had underestimated her. And soon, they would pay the price. The tide turns. The final days of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was nearly unbearable. Each side had presented its arguments, and now the time had come for closing statements. The defense had done everything in its power to undermine the case, casting doubts, questioning the integrity of witnesses, and attempting to deflect attention from the actions of the accused. But despite their efforts, the truth had a stubborn way of remaining present, flickering just beneath the surface. Maya was determined to see this through to the end. She knew that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about the bigger picture, the ideals upon which the system was supposed to be built. She had heard the stories of countless individuals who had been wronged by those who held power, of people whose voices were silenced before they even had a chance to speak. But now, it was her turn to be the one who made sure those voices were heard. The courtroom was packed with spectators on the final day. Word of the trial had spread throughout the city, and the crowd was eager to see how this case would unfold. There was a quiet buzz in the air, a hum of anticipation as the judge took her seat. Maya's robes felt heavier than usual, but she didn't let it show. She had always prided herself on her calm and composed demeanor, and now was no different. She turned her attention to the defense attorney, who stood at the podium, preparing to deliver his closing remarks. Whitaker was as polished and charismatic as ever, his voice smooth and confident as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "what we have here is an unfortunate situation, but one that is based on misunderstandings. The men who stand before you are not criminals. They are hard-working individuals who were simply offering assistance to someone in need. Yes, their methods may have been unorthodox, but there was no malice in their intentions." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Maya could feel the eyes of the jury on him, and she could see the doubt creeping in. Whitaker had a way of making the worst actions seem almost reasonable. It was his trademark, a tactic that had worked for him time and time again. But let's not forget, Whitaker continued, that the real story here is one of opportunity. These men were trying to extend a hand, to offer help to someone who seemed to have nowhere else to turn. Instead, they were met with aggression and false accusations. Maya's hand tightened on the gavel, her jaw clenched. This was the moment. This was the point where she needed to remind everyone of the truth. The lies and half-truths spun by the defense couldn't be allowed to take root. As Whitaker finished his argument and returned to his seat, Maya stood, her gaze fixed on the jury. The room went silent. Her voice was steady and commanding, filling the space as she began her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice cutting through the stillness, "what we have here is not a case of misunderstanding. This is not a case of well-meaning individuals trying to help someone in need. This is a case of abuse, manipulation, and control." She paused, allowing her words to resonate before continuing. Kiera did not ask for help. She did not ask to be harassed, to be cornered, to be treated like she was less than human. These men who claimed to be offering assistance, used their positions of power to manipulate her, to make her feel as though she had no choice but to accept what they were offering. Maya's voice rose, a fire igniting within her as she spoke the truth she had carried with her for so long. But the truth is simple. They didn't want to help her. They wanted to control her. And when someone like Kiera, someone who isn't supposed to be heard, stands up for herself, they respond with violence and degradation. The room was utterly still, every person hanging on to Maya's words as she stood tall behind the bench, her eyes scanning the jury, the witnesses, the defendants. Kiera didn't deserve to be treated this way. "No one does," Maya said, her voice unwavering. "What happened here is not a mere misunderstanding. It is a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue. The problem isn't just these men or their actions, it's the way society has allowed this behavior to thrive. It's the way people like Kiera are treated as invisible, as if their dignity can be stripped away without consequence." Her gaze flicked briefly to the men sitting at the defense table. She could feel their unease, their discomfort. She could see how their posture had shifted, how they now seemed to be second-guessing their every word, their every move. This was the power of the truth. It was a force that could not be ignored, no matter how hard they tried. Justice is not just about enforcing laws. It is about protecting the vulnerable, the oppressed. It is about ensuring that every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, is afforded the same rights, the same respect. And that is why I will not allow these men to walk free. I will not let them escape the consequences of their actions simply because they are privileged by the system they inhabit. Maya paused again, her gaze piercing as she surveyed the jury. "You have seen the evidence. You have heard the testimonies. You know what happened. And now, it is up to you to deliver justice." Her words echoed in the room as she took her seat. The courtroom remained silent for several moments before the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Maya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had done everything she could to ensure the truth was heard. Now, all she could do was wait. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Maya found Kiera standing with her lawyer. The young woman was visibly shaking, her hands clenched at her sides. Maya walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Maya asked softly. Kiera nodded, but her eyes were filled with a mix of hope and fear. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to believe that what you said is enough. I want to believe they'll do the right thing." Maya smiled, a small but reassuring gesture. "You've done everything right, Kiera. You've been brave. And now, it's in their hands. But no matter what happens, know this, you have already won. You stood up for yourself, for your dignity. That's more than most people ever do." Kiera's eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, Maya was reminded of the young woman who had walked into that courtroom, frightened and unsure of her place in the world. Now, Kiera was standing taller, her shoulders more squared, her gaze more focused. Whatever the outcome of the trial, she was no longer the same person who had been harassed and degraded in that alley. The door to the courtroom opened, and the jury began to file in. Maya's heart raced as she watched them take their seats. She had done everything she could. Now, it was time for them to make their decision. The foreperson stood up, holding a piece of paper in their hand. Maya's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. The foreperson cleared their throat. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty as charged. Maya felt a surge of emotion wash over her. The room erupted into a murmur of disbelief and relief. Kiara's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth as she took in the words. She had won. Justice had been served. Maya nodded, her face calm but her heart swelling with pride. She had made sure the truth had been heard, and in the end, it had been enough. The men, now convicted, looked pale and defeated as they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. They had underestimated Kiara, underestimated Maya, and most of all, underestimated the power of justice. For Kiara, the road ahead would not be easy, but she had taken her first step toward reclaiming her power. And for Maya, this victory was just another reminder that the fight for justice, though long and difficult, was always worth it. A new beginning. The days following the trial were a blur for Kiara. The weight of the verdict, the shock, the relief, and the overwhelming realization that she had been heard, seemed to hang in the air around her. Maya had kept her promise. Justice had been served, but it was more than just a legal victory. It was a triumph of human dignity, a reminder that when the truth was spoken, it had the power to change lives. The city was abuzz with the news of the verdict. For many, it felt like a turning point. The case had sparked conversations in the streets, at dinner tables, in schools and workplaces. It was more than a single trial. It was a moment of reckoning, a collective reminder of the ongoing battle for equality and respect in a world that often seemed indifferent to those on the margins. But amidst the noise, Kiara found herself seeking solace in the quiet moments. One afternoon, not long after the verdict had been handed down, Maya invited Kiara to her office. It had been a few weeks since the trial, and Kiara had been keeping a low profile, still processing everything that had happened. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. The young woman who had walked into that courtroom, uncertain and afraid, was no longer the same person who left it. Maya's office was a comfortable space, with large windows that overlooked the city. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the atmosphere felt calm, organized. Kiara had only been here a handful of times during the trial, but today, she felt a sense of nervous anticipation. "Kiara, I'm glad you could make it," Maya said as Kiara stepped into the office. Her voice was warm, the same voice that had anchored Kiara during the trial, giving her strength when she needed it most. "Thanks for having me," Kiara replied, her voice a little unsteady as she took a seat across from Maya's desk. Maya smiled, a reassuring, motherly gesture that made Kiara feel just a little more at ease. She knew that Maya's role in the courtroom had been pivotal in securing the verdict, but she also knew that Maya was more than just a judge. She had been a guide, a protector. It was because of her that Kiara had found the courage to speak out, to demand what was rightfully hers. "I know it's been a lot to take in," Maya began, her tone gentle. "The trial, the media, everything that has come with it. But I wanted to check in with you, to see how you're doing." Kiara took a deep breath, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I don't even know what to say," she admitted. "Everything feels so overwhelming. Sometimes I think I'm still in shock, like I'm waiting for someone to tell me it was all a dream." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "It's perfectly normal to feel that way, Kiara. You've been through something that most people will never have to experience. But you've come out of it stronger. And that's something no one can take from you." The words felt like a lifeline, and Kiara clung to them. She had spent so long being told that she didn't matter, that her voice was too small, too insignificant. But now, she was learning to believe in her own power. It was a long road, and she knew there would be more struggles ahead, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. Maya leaned forward, her expression serious but filled with encouragement. "You've been through something traumatic, Kiara. And it's important to honor the feelings that come with that. But I also want you to know that this is a new beginning for you. You've shown the world who you are, and you've earned the right to be proud of who you've become. Kiara's heart swelled at Maya's words. I don't know if I can ever be the person I was before. But I'm starting to believe that maybe I don't need to be. Maya smiled. You don't need to be. The person you are now is enough. You've grown into someone who commands respect. You've learned to stand your ground, and that's a gift that many people never realize they have. I see a future for you, one that's full of possibilities. Kiara's eyes sparkled with a mixture of hope and curiosity. A future, she echoed softly. What do you mean? I mean, Maya continued, that this is just the beginning of your story. You've overcome so much, Kiara, and there's still so much more for you to do. You have a voice now, and it's a powerful one. You can use that voice to help others who are still struggling, to fight for justice in ways you never thought possible. Kiara felt a sense of clarity settle over her, something she hadn't experienced in years. The doubt and uncertainty that had once clouded her thoughts were beginning to lift. She had spent so much of her life trying to survive, trying to make it through each day without breaking. But now, Maya was showing her that survival wasn't enough. She could do more than just survive. She could thrive. Kiara looked out the window, her mind turning over Maya's words. The city below seemed bustling with life, filled with people going about their daily routines. But in that moment, Kiara felt like she had unlocked a new world, a world full of opportunity, filled with the potential for change. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't have a clear path laid out for her. But for the first time in her life, she knew that the future was hers to shape. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Kiara said slowly, turning back to face Maya. About using my voice, helping others. I want to do that. I want to make a difference, to show other people that they don't have to stay silent. Maya's smile widened, pride gleaming in her eyes. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You've already started, Kiara. Your courage in speaking out in that courtroom, it's already inspired so many. Now, you just have to keep moving forward. You have so much to offer. Kiara stood, feeling a surge of determination coursing through her. Thank you, Maya. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Maya stood as well, walking over to Kiara and placing a hand on her shoulder. You did this, Kiara. I just helped you see what was already inside of you. As Kiara left the office, she felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She walked through the hallways with a new sense of purpose, a new vision of herself. The world outside still seemed as chaotic and unpredictable as ever, but Kiara no longer felt powerless against it. She had the strength to face whatever came next. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would never again have to face them alone.